Now I'll show you the context of where we've been. The first few classes, we've just defined what a boundary is. By the title alone, it doesn't sound very appealing, does it? Boundaries in marriage, that sounds so confining. But no, when you're in marriage and you're pursuing holiness, you will have for each other, and I hate to use the word rules, but expectations of behavior for each one to show respect and understanding. But it has to go both ways, or else there is not the proper relationship that can be mutually beneficial and by God's design to show their roles of how God relates to His people, the church, and vice versa. His church is submissive to the groom. So we're applying the laws. Last week we dealt with so much, but I'm eager to get to this. This is the primary portion of the book, but if you don't understand boundaries, then we can't apply them as easily. So I'm eager for hopefully getting as much through this as we can. When I click this button, I think the next video will start, the first video. This is a 6-minute review of the first 5 laws, the first 5 principles that will catch us up to speed. And right after it's over, I will get up here and cover the book content on page 50 in the book, 50. I've told Phoebe and the tech crew that if it's a difficult challenge ethically for you, or maybe doctrinally perhaps, to hear that little jingle at the beginning of that sound clip or at the beginning of the video that doesn't bother the people who produce it, but in this setting it might, and I understand the differentiation. However, some people choose to not differentiate, and so we want to honor that. So bottom line, that knob will be turned down, or at least try to be turned down during the title, but then as soon as that starts to fade, it'll be turned up. You might miss a word or two, but that's okay. Enjoy the authors reviewing the first 5 laws in an MP4 format, 30 frames per second, because I didn't want to save that much space. I didn't want to take up that much space in my own hard drives. So when I click this button, let's see what happens. Yes, it's moving, so that's a good sign. All right.
Whenever we speak about boundary issues, we most often hear questions like, how do I handle my husband's lack of intimacy? Or, what should I say to my wife when she overspends? We find it difficult to answer questions like these because often we don't know the details about the couples.
A husband who is not intimate may be distant because he has trouble trusting people, including his wife. Or maybe he's self-absorbed. Or maybe he's just normal and it's his wife who has unrealistic expectations.
A wife who overspends may have problems structuring herself, or she may be in denial about a very real financial problem. Or imagine this, she might even have a controlling husband.
Boundary issues in marriage always require an understanding of the situation. So we believe that in the long run, learning principles really helps more than learning techniques. And that's why we talk about the laws of boundaries, not just as practical strategies, but as principles by which to structure your own marriage.
These laws of boundaries are not about marriage as it should be. They are about marriage as it really is. Like the law of gravity, the laws of boundaries are always in force, whether or not we are aware of them. These laws lay the foundation of how responsibility works in life. Let's look at the first one.
The first law is the law of sowing and reaping. Simply put, this principle means that our actions have consequences. When we do loving and responsible things, people should draw close to us. When we're unloving or irresponsible, people withdraw from us. Whenever Randall was angry or upset, he would withdraw from his wife Amy and their kids. Amy would handle Randall's mood. She'd try to cheer him up and coach everyone on how to walk on eggshells around Dad. But Randall was sowing seeds of anger, selfishness, and withdrawal of love, yet he was not paying any of the consequences. He had no reason to change because Amy was dealing with his problem. You see, things don't change in a marriage until the spouse who is taking responsibility for a problem that is not hers decides to say or do something about that. Doing so helps place both the sowing and the reaping with the same person, and that begins to solve the boundary violation.
The second law of boundaries is the law of responsibility. We are responsible to each other, but not for each other. Spouses may help each other with the burdens of life, and they should, like financial burdens or health or emotional crises that come along. But ultimately, each person must take care of his own daily responsibilities, including one's feelings, attitudes, values, the handling of life's everyday difficulties. A proper view of responsibility is necessary to set limits in a marriage. If one spouse feels no sense of responsibility to the other, well, this spouse is, in effect, trying to live married life as a single person. On the other hand, you can't cross the line of responsibility. It's your responsibility to not take ownership of your mate's life.
The third law is the law of power. This law clarifies what we do and what we don't have power over. We don't have the power to change someone else, but we can influence them. We also have the power to confess and submit and repent of our own hurtful ways and then be willing to change. Specifically, we must acknowledge that we have no power over the attitudes and actions of other people, but we can influence them, and influence really has its own power. You and I also have the power to confess, submit, and repent of our own hurtful ways, to ask for God's help, to be willing to change, to identify ways we are contributing to our own marriage problems, and, over time, to change the unhelpful ways we are dealing with these issues. You see, spouses often try to use boundaries to assert power over a mate, and this doesn't work. The fruit of the Spirit is self-control. It's not other control. Furthermore, nothing is more conducive to a spouse's growth than a mate who really and sincerely wants to change.
Fourth, the law of respect states that if we wish for others to respect our boundaries, it's our responsibility to respect theirs. See, we can't expect others to cherish our limits if we don't cherish their limits as well. We all get excited about finally being able to say no, to set limits, and to become free to choose. But we don't feel as excited about hearing no, about having our spouse set limits, and about having our spouse make choices on their own. But mature adults desire the freedom of others as much as their own. Granting of freedom to one's spouse is one reason why the law of respect fosters love. After all, loving your mate means desiring and protecting his or her freedom of choice. It means dying to your wish for your mate to see things your way all the time, and appreciating that she has her own mind and values and feelings. Respecting and valuing your mate's boundaries is the key to being close and loving. Your spouse experiences the gift of freedom from you and sees the love you're extending by giving this freedom. When you respect your spouse's boundaries, you're paving the way to having yours respected as well.
The fifth law of boundaries is the law of motivation. This law states that we must be free to say no before we can wholeheartedly say yes. See, no one can actually love another if he feels he doesn't have a choice not to love. Giving your time, your love, or your vulnerability to your spouse requires that you make your own choice based on your values and not out of fear. To the extent that you're free to say no, then you're free to say yes. And this is why sometimes it's just good to say, I can't wholeheartedly say yes to this, so I'll have to say no at this time. After all, no spouse in his right mind really wants a mate who complies with his wishes simply out of fear.
Take some time now to consider how these 5 laws apply to marriage in general and to your marriage in particular.
I enjoy watching great content. I've got to do my part and teach, or else they wouldn't think that I'm teaching tonight. But that well summarized the first 50 minutes of the chapter's study up until this point. So now let's highlight the next 5 laws, laws 6 through 10, and then we'll hopefully have time to conclude with the video that well summarizes these after some teaching. We're on page 50 in the book. Let's just continue. Law number 6 is the law of evaluation. I'm going to dramatize some of the reading as we now look at scenarios. Trent was at his wit's end. His wife Megan had once again run the credit card up over the limit. Whenever she had a problem or felt down, shopping seemed to lift her spirits. Even though they were struggling financially, Megan did not see that her spending was a problem. We'll pay it off someday, she rationalized. It's just a loan. Trent, however, feared that their dire situation financially was a concern, and yet he always tried, therefore, to work harder to provide more money, hoping that this would solve the problem. It actually propagated it and made it even worse, as resentment no doubt would build. When I asked Trent if he had considered canceling the credit card, he reacted quickly. I couldn't do that. You don't know how hard her life is, and everybody needs an outlet, and you should just see her face when she comes home and she's just beaming. What would she feel like if I were to do that? Well, tears started welling up in his eyes. She would just be really hurt. Now, he's going to introduce an idea soon, the difference between injury or pain. Keep that in your mind for a minute. The difference between an injury or inflicting pain. There's a difference. She never had anything as a little girl, and she grew up very poor, so taking away what little she has would just devastate her. I can't do that to someone I love. Then, he says, Trent struggled in his evaluation of Megan's pain. He knew how impoverished her life had been, and she felt deeply for her, or he felt deeply, but he wanted to bring her some relief. Yet, through his permissiveness, he helped her, in that way, his permissiveness was helping her feel better, but it was running and ruining their financial status. Trent confused two very different ideas, pain and injury. And here's where he words himself so carefully. Megan felt no pain when she shopped extravagantly, yet the marriage was being injured by her impulsiveness and by Trent's passivity. She wasn't feeling hurt. She was not feeling hurt, but a great deal of harm was being done. Conversely, when Trent set limits on the credit card, Megan felt a lot of pain, but no great harm was being done. Interesting, isn't it? So Trent reduced the spending limit and asked Megan to agree to not use the card for a month every time she overspent. So here's a budget. If you overspend, that affects your next month's ability to spend. I'm sure the guy would have probably wanted no spending at all, but there is a balance there, right? Megan was angry and resentful towards Trent, but she didn't fall apart like he had feared. In fact, she began to grow. Megan's spending had kept her anesthetized from negative aspects of her life, such as loss, failure, and stress. I'm not paying attention to them. I don't feel them. But without her credit card cushion, Megan had to deal with those issues, and she began maturing. She was in pain, but she was not being injured. In fact, she was healing. Fascinating, isn't it? So with this being the case, I forgot to show some of these questions to review as we go, but under the law 6 here, just because someone is in pain doesn't necessarily mean something bad is happening. In fact, something good might be going on, like the spouse growing up or maturing and healing. This is the essence of the law of evaluation. We need to evaluate the pain of our boundaries. That's how our behaviors are affecting others, basically. Do they cause pain and lead to injury? Something good being harmed? Or do they cause pain that leads to growth, which are hard feelings, but with good results? This is a good study. This is fascinating to evaluate why we think like we do. When we have a negative feeling, it may not mean something's bad, except that something is not working in the way I'm living life, and so we need to make those adjustments. It is, he says, unloving to set limits where a spouse is caused harm. But it can be just as unloving to avoid setting a limit because you don't want that spouse to be uncomfortable. So, we want to not bring those hard feelings, those uncomfortable moments, and so let's not set a boundary and propagate a problem that needs to be addressed. Well, we can't do that either. We've all gone through this. And how long do things go by and consequences come? And it's harder to deal with things in the moment until you have classes like this that remind you, if there is an issue, let's deal with it so that, and this is one of my favorite lines, from this point forward, we can have the blessings that come with proper management of whatever the situation requires. So we're doing well on time, but that's because we're skipping a lot, obviously, in the book if you have one with you. But law number 7, the law of proactivity. I'm tempted to summarize because of time, and I think I should in this case. The law of proactivity basically means to take action to solve a problem based on your values, your wants, and your needs. You have to be so aware. Some people would accuse you of being selfish, but that's where you have conflict within the spouse or the marriage, the household. But if there's mutual understanding that you're wanting to grow and have respect towards each other, and it's shown clearly both ways, then you can have conversations that say based on, and then you can explain, and then here's what I'm feeling, and then here's what I would request, but here's a suggestion. Let's be open for discussion. The law of proactivity, though, is essentially taking action. Proactive people solve problems without having to blow up emotionally. This is where I'd like to pick up the reading on page 53. They, the proactive people, just are their boundaries. They don't have to do a boundary as often as reactive people do. It's not a blow-up type of action. The illustration I overlooked in summary is that some things build over time. Smirky remarks, comments, things that people think are funny when they're really not, but it's a way to attack. And those build over time. And then the person reacts and goes off the wall, and you think, over that? Well, it's not just over that. It's over everything that it represents. That's not right. Usually when you're angered, that's a sign that something's wrong and not addressed. So those are warning signs, either something with the way I'm thinking or something externally that needs to be addressed. So the law of proactivity has three facets. One, reactive boundaries are a necessary part of growth in marriage because essentially, if you're not feeling freedom or control, then there are issues to freedom for your own abilities. Then there's a problem to address. Sometimes you're protesting in that way, something that's not right. But you can't just stay there. Facet 2, reactive boundaries are not sufficient for growth. That's not how you do it. Most people just have reactive boundaries when they get mad and they don't have the tools to advance. But here's step 3, facet 3. Proactive boundaries maintain love, they maintain freedom and responsibility. The 3 pillars of a good relationship here. Interactive fellowship of intimacy. Proactive people keep their freedom, disagree, and confront issues, but are able to basically hold it together, hold on to the love that they have for their spouse, and they do not get caught up in an emotional storm. They have worked through those reactive stages. And again, I'll say, if there's something sirening off in your mind, something not right, pray for wisdom, and good discussion will help. It may not always be fixed in the moment, but it's being addressed. So with wisdom and care and love and respect, address those problems. Take initiative. Be proactive. Point 8, law number 8. The law of envy. When you read something like this in a book, it's kind of confusing. The law of envy? Is he wanting me to be envious? Well, let's actually read the chapter. I don't think that's what he means, but there are principles at play. Envy is a thing. It's a sinful thing. So how does this law, which is always at play, how can we use it to our advantage and prevent those arguments that otherwise would come? Don't confuse envy with desire. Desire is good, but it can be perverted. It can even lead into envy, which is outside of our realm of responsibility. And he continues this way. The most powerful obstacle to overcome is the law of envy, which states that we will never get what we want if we focus outside of our boundaries onto what others have. Envy devalues what we have, thinking it's not enough. We then focus on what others have, all while resenting them for having the good things we don't possess. So I won't feel happy because this person over here has what I would desire, but then focusing, it devalues the blessings that you have. And there's more that I'll discuss later, but there's no one person that will ever be everything to any one person. So it's a balance of maturity and resolve to be committed to the covenant. That being the case, we go back to this law of envy in terms of relationship. Envy is miserable because we are dissatisfied with our state, yet powerless to change it. And we're talking now even circumstantially. This is why it is such a powerful obstacle in daily living. The envious person doesn't set limits on himself or herself because he is not looking at himself long enough to figure out what choices he has. Instead, he's just envious and keeping him focused on everything else, the happiness of others. Don't confuse envy with desire. Desire involves wanting something, growth, maturity. It motivates us to take action. And then he quotes Psalm 37:4. Hey, if we desire God, that natural desire for God, he'll give us the desires of our heart. But desire doesn't focus on our emptiness. Desire, nor does it focus on how lucky others are. No, desire just preserves the goodness and value of what we have and lives in a way to ourselves, being responsible for what we are responsible for, and in this case, in the relationship. How am I responsible for the blessings that I can be accountable for in this relationship and build it up? He says in a marriage, envy can lie at the heart of many boundary problems. And then he continues to say that he gives an example of some husband who was always in a take charge type spirit. And he, let's see, I'll read the example for your benefit. His friend Bev says that her husband Jim, he's always been so decisive and take charge while I don't have a lot of power. And that makes it harder for me to say no to him. Why is that? He asked. Well, because he'll overwhelm me and control me like he does people at work. I don't appreciate being treated like that, but what's more, I don't want to be like he is either. So I can't be the decisive person he is. I don't want to become in any way, to any degree, like that which was driving her nuts, she says. Well, she is setting herself up for failure, to not set any boundaries and to propagate the problem and lead to many more. So he says it was less threatening to cry foul to Jim than avoid developing her own limits. You can't set limits in marriage until you are looking at yourself as part of the problem by cause or effect or how you react, and at a great deal of the solution. So you can be part of the solution. Work through every envy, own your own problems, and take action. Know who you are, know your faults, of course, but see how you're looking at the situation and just wisely approach in the spirit of love and respect. And then that's better dialogue. These are all set forth as the ideal, of course, first. Law number 9, the law of activity. The law of activity, a lot like proactivity, but a little different. I will summarize this. Be wise to promptly make the first move. That's the law of activity. Wisely make the first move. When you see a problem, take initiative. Don't be passive. I like this line. I do want to read 2 or 3 sentences that will make you think either about yourself or other people. You just can't help but think about other people when you read things like this, but also yourself. And sometimes we wish we could meet people from this point forward without knowing their trail, but how much are we defined this way also? Active spouses, those who, just see problems, take initiative, confront problems, solve things. Active spouses have an edge in boundary setting. Taking initiative increases one's chances to learn from the mistakes. Active people make a lot of mistakes, and the wise ones grow from them. In other words, the mistakes are found when you realize you've crossed a boundary of preference within the people in your life, whether they've been maturely set or not. But you learn from what you do. They experience the depth of God's forgiveness because they do things for which they need to be forgiven. Passive people, though, have trouble learning this as much because they are afraid to take the risks. Because of this, they also have a harder time taking charge of their own lives and their boundaries. So sometimes people fear losing love. They fear seeing themselves as the bad guy, or they just don't think that their lives are their own problems, their own responsibilities. Sometimes they fear making mistakes. For a lot of reasons, this is the case. But when one spouse is active and the other person is not, and you may have seen this in married couples and maybe even yourself in years past, does this apply? Think about this. When one is active in this way and one is passive, problems can occur. The active spouse may dominate the passive one. The active spouse may feel abandoned by the passive one. The passive spouse may become too dependent on the active one. Or the passive spouse may resent the power of the active one. Likewise, be too intimidated enough to not even say no. And I encourage by application quickly, it's not stated here, but it is implied, be the active spouse to inquire how your behaviors or thoughts on X, Y, or Z is affecting your partner, start that conversation. Be ready for it, but start that conversation. Take that first move. Take initiative. You may be wondering, he says, how the law of proactivity differs from the law of activity, and here's the difference, and you'll hear this summarized in the video. The difference is the law of proactivity has to do with taking action based on deliberate, thoughtful values versus emotional reactions. That's the idea of that. But the law of activity is simply taking initiative. Taking initiative, solving a problem that may not even be yours, but you see it in the relationship and you must address it. We're doing well on time based on what little we had to cover tonight. Law number 10 is the law of exposure. I enjoyed thinking about this one. It was a particular interest to study. I'm omitting half of what you see in the book if you're following along with me on page 57. You may have limits, you may have definitions, you may have feelings, you may have opinions, but you may not be communicating them. A boundary that is not communicated is a boundary that is not working or at work. It might be ink on a paper, but it's not yet enforced law or policy, right? So it has the same net effect in the marriage as if there were no boundary at all. The only difference is you can't hide. Someone said when you bury your feelings or swallow your pride, your stomach keeps score. In something like that. So you can't deny who you are in order for the perceived peace of a relationship. So sometimes those discussions will bring out what's not good about you, but it's good for that intimate sharing. The law of exposure states that we need to communicate our boundaries to each other. Key quote, God designed boundaries to promote love and truth. Spouses need to make clear what they do or don't want. And as you learn yourself, that's where married couples can grow, but we're still learning ourselves in some ways. Sometimes we learn things about ourselves we wish were not true. But that's where a good spouse can help if we're maturing towards holiness together. They need to work on understanding what their spouse is saying. When boundaries are exposed, two souls can be connected in the marriage. This is spiritual intimacy. But when boundaries are unexposed, spouses are less emotionally present in the marriage. Love struggles. I believe in communication so that there is an understanding. Key line to conclude this chapter. When we expose our boundaries to the light of relationship, we can be fully connected to our spouse. We can resolve problems more easily and can take a stand to actively love our spouse by risking the conflict. And he doesn't hide that. It's risking conflict. And that's not always easy. But that's where I suggest and I interpolate this idea. I insert this idea. Choose a designated time and place different from the normal settings so that there is an awareness that this is a focus on something different that needs to be addressed in a way that focus can be with no distraction. That's a good piece of advice. We can resolve problems, minimize this conflict, but exposure is the only way for healing and growth to take place. The authors will soon do a great job summarizing what you've heard and sometimes repeating it for your benefit in about a 6-minute clip. It's well worth if it goes into the time of the first bell. But I like this prayer at the end of the workbook. I think it's the workbook or the leader's guide that has this prayer. And you don't have to word everything just right, of course, in the same way, verbatim. But it does have 2 key petitions. And the idea is, in your prayers to God, you can say, Lord, please open my eyes to where the problems lie. What a great petition that is. Every couple has problems, so why not ask, Lord, help me see where they are. And to give me a heart that will love my spouse despite them and grant me the courage and wisdom to basically address them. Wow. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I love. And those, you can learn a lot in someone's petitions. That's a sermon right there in a prayer. So I hope that you can take that with you tonight. I'm going to click on this little slide advancer, and the next video should play. I meant to tell Phoebe earlier that, the technicality. The first video in any new chapter segment or session will have 2 title screens, and after that, in the class, it's just 1 title screen, I think. But that being the case, we'll go to the next video and conclude. Just right after this, go ahead and conclude. There is a summary chart of these 10 laws available for you on your way out. And those can be kept anywhere in your wallet, purse, on the fridge, and that way they're just summarized. 10 laws, 2 sessions, right there in your eyes for quick reference. And then we'll enjoy this summary in the form of a review and conclusion to Chapter 2. Looking forward to this. See if it animates on its own. I did a slide adjustment earlier and wonder if I click next, if it'll start playing. Yes! I always love it when it works.
Now, the remaining 5 laws of boundaries. Remember, like the law of gravity, these laws of boundaries are always in force, whether or not we're aware of them. These laws lay the foundation of how responsibility really works in life.
The 6th law of boundaries is the law of evaluation. Now, that law reminds us that it's our responsibility to evaluate the pain our boundaries cause other people. Do they cause pain that leads to injury? Or do they cause the pain that leads to growth? Trent's wife, Megan, had once again run the credit card up over the limit. And she didn't see that her spending was a problem, but Trent feared their dire financial state. When I asked Trent if he had considered canceling the credit card, he said, "Well, I couldn't do that. She would be really hurt." He went on to explain, as a little girl, she had never had much of anything, and he felt like taking away the little that she had now would devastate her. He said, "I just couldn't do that to someone that I love." Well, while it's unloving to set limits with a spouse to harm him, it can be just as unloving to avoid setting a limit with your spouse because you don't want to be uncomfortable. Just because someone is in pain doesn't necessarily mean that something bad is happening. Sometimes discomfort is an opportunity for growth. Don't neglect setting limits in your marriage because of a fear of causing pain. Pain can be the best friend your relationship ever had.
7th, the law of proactivity is a call to solve problems without blowing up, without waiting until we're reacting to others, instead of intentionally living out our values. Proactive boundaries maintain love and freedom and reality in relationships. Proactive people keep their freedom, and they disagree and confront issues all the time in marriage, but they are able to hold on to the love they feel for their spouse, and they don't get caught up in an emotional storm. So work on setting proactive boundaries in your marriage. They're deliberate boundaries built on love and based on your values.
One obstacle to setting boundaries in marriage is envy, and the 8th law of boundaries addresses this matter. The law of envy states that we will never get what we want if we focus outside of our boundaries on what others have. Envy is the process of devaluing what we have. Envy is thinking that what we have is not enough. Envy causes misery because we're dissatisfied with our state perpetually, yet powerless to change it. The envious person doesn't set limits often because he's not looking at himself long enough to figure out what choices he has. Instead, his envious eye is keeping him focused upon the happiness of others. You can't set limits in marriage until you're looking at yourself as part of the problem and as a great deal of the solution. Work through your envy, own your problems, and then take action.
The 9th law of boundaries is the law of activity. It states that it's our responsibility to take the initiative to solve our problems rather than being passive. See, all things being equal, active spouses really have an edge in the boundary setting process. Taking initiative increases one's chances to learn from your mistakes. Active people make lots of mistakes, and wise people grow from those mistakes. They try something, they experience a limit, and then they adapt. Passive people have trouble learning because they're so scared to take a risk. And because of this, they have a harder time taking charge of their lives and making and keeping boundaries. By the way, a quick word in case you're wondering how the law of proactivity differs from the law of activity. The law of proactivity has to do with taking action based on deliberate, thought-out values versus our emotional reactions. But the law of activity has to do with taking the initiative versus being passive and waiting for someone else to make the first move. After all, as Edmund Burke, the British statesman, said, all that's needed for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. So doing nothing or being passive really stunts our boundary development and growth in marriage.
Finally, law number 10 is the law of exposure. This law states that it's our responsibility to communicate our boundaries to each other. When boundaries are exposed, two souls can be connected in the marriage, but when boundaries are unexposed, spouses are less emotionally present in the marriage and love struggles. Imagine a husband who withdraws when his wife's self-centeredness bothers him. Rather than isolating and hiding his feelings, an option which will cost her any genuine connection with him, he would do far better to let his wife know. Honey, when I tell you what I'm bothered about, it makes it difficult that you become critical of me and focus the issue on yourself. So I withdraw from you. I really want to be close to you, and I'll work towards this. But if you continue to not listen to me, I may need to just go to talk to my friends instead where I can be heard. When we expose our boundaries to the light of relationship, we can be fully connected to our spouses. Exposure is the only way for healing and growth to really take place.
Apply these 10 laws to your marriage and see how they change the way you relate to each other. Remember, you can't break laws forever without there being some consequences. And besides, these laws will help you shape your marriage into one that's based on God's principles of relationship.
So if all the studying of the class only introduced us to that material, they explained it very well by way of review. So I hope that you are blessed this week applying these principles, processing and practicing each one in all your relationships. So